So, Andrew, we're going to start off with a very basic general question. Can you define for our audience what exactly are the culture wars? What are their origins? And what are the tradition? Who are the traditional players in these culture wars?
Yeah, definitely. So the culture wars are something that has always existed in American history. It's just a debate that various groups have had about what it means to be an American and how to define American identity. Um, but the term culture wars doesn't come into use until the late 1980s, early 1990s. So that speech by Buchanan, which he gave in 1992, really sort of punctuated the height of the culture wars period, specifically if you want to sort of focus on the 80s and 90s. And the two sides of the culture wars were sort of progressive, secular liberals against conservative, religious, mostly Protestants, but just in general, conservative religious people. Sometimes they played out in partisan ways, Democrat versus Republican, although the political party system was not necessarily that which defined the culture wars. So I would argue that the culture wars that we understand as emerging in the 80s and 90s, and which we're still in many ways living with, emerged to were sort of a product of the 1960s, the social movements that emerged in the 1960s. And here I'm talking about not just civil rights, but the Black Power movement and the other sort of identity power movement, Chicano movement, American Indian movement, feminism, or what at the time was called women's liberation, the gay liberation movement. These movements sort of coalesced together alongside the counterculture to really challenge traditional cultural framework that existed prior to the 1960s that many Americans, not most, but many, I would say a majority of Americans sort of conceptualized as what it meant to be an American. And so you have these movements really pushing against this framework in ways that disturbed a lot of people, in particular white Protestant or Catholic religious conservatives, someone like Patrick Buchanan. And so those are the two sides of the culture wars, and that's kind of the more recent history of the culture wars. That's kind of like the time frame we're looking at.
Okay, would you say so? One of the themes that we have at This Is Revolution is what we call the 50-year counter-revolution, meaning the period after the civil rights movement, starting with Nixon and everything onwards, is a kind of a counter-revolution to the New Deal civil rights coalition that comes out of the 60s. And much of the politics that we see, including discourse around race, around racial inclusion, around the state, the welfare state, is couched in much of the battle lines that were drawn in that period. Would you then view that the culture wars, the contemporary manifestation of the culture wars, are part of a phenomenon that exists within the context of the 50-year counter-revolution?
Yeah, definitely. I would argue that so I don't know, like liberals like to think that the culture wars are started by conservatives, that conservatives fan the flames of culture wars. And it often feels that way. I mean, recently, if you look at President Trump, he was the ultimate culture warrior president. He wasn't at home unless he was fanning the flames of the culture war on Twitter or elsewhere. But really, I think the beginning of the culture wars, you have to root in what I would consider a cultural revolution of the 1960s. And so the the counter revolution to that cultural revolution being waged by a conservative movement, being waged by the Christian right, is very much a way to think about the counter revolution. Now, it's not precisely, you can't precisely match it up with the counter revolution to the New Deal or social democracy. It doesn't precisely match up that. There's some sort of paradoxes there. But the time frame is, it works with your theory, I would say, the sort of premise of your show, definitely.
To hear the rest of this show and more, you can find us at This Is Revolution Podcast. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, Podbean, Pandora, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, you can find a new episode every Wednesday on the Zero Books YouTube channel. This is Revolution.